Gayatri Spivak's essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, is incredibly well known. Google Scholar records more than 25,000 citations. That is a huge number, yet I have ambivalent feelings about it. Don't get me wrong, 25,000 citations. Anything cited that widely must be doing something right. It's a great title. Its core idea is important. Its criticisms of the naivety of French philosophy are probably justified, and it finishes with what Spivak has made clear is a personal story about the suicide of a female relative, which acts as a powerful symbol for the notion of epistemic violence. But the writing, the writing is so obtuse, contorted and packed with jargon. Again, don't get me wrong, there are good reasons to employ specialist language. Take, for example, that title. What exactly do we mean by speak? Obviously, most women, Spivak's main concern, can speak, but they don't speak with one voice, and the co-opted term subaltern always refers to a group. So the answer is obviously no by definition. Not very interesting, unless it's not the act of speech, but whether something is heard that is implied in the question. That is more interesting, but to be so, the question has to become part of the inquiry. Historians call that problematizing, and if I wasn't trying to make a point, I would have just said the question is only interesting if we problematize speech. Technical language, jargon, helps communicate complex concepts quickly and precisely, and in academia, that is the main justification for it. But is that how Spivak uses jargon in her essay? Well, let's take a closer look at it. For this video, I am using the version of the essay published in 1994 in Colonial Discourse and Post-Colonial Theory. There are other versions, but this is the one you will find online. Spivak divides the paper into 4 parts, using unobtrusive Roman numerals as headings. And more subtly, on 12 occasions, she divides the paper again by leaving a line space and then not indenting the following paragraph. So there are 13 uneven parts or sections. I've numbered the paragraphs in my version because paragraphs are a choice authors make and so are more meaningful than pagination. The first part, which is the longest, is an extended critique of a piece published by Deleuze and Foucault. Now, it is very weird to use a term like subaltern, which was coined in its modern sense in 1982, if you're going to analyse something published 10 years earlier. Deleuze and Foucault cannot be talking about the subaltern because it is an academic concept that did not exist in 1972. That should raise suspicions immediately. Spivak's critique of this piece stems from her own Marxist position that people are oppressed through economic power by a European system which also misrepresents who the oppressed people are, and that unless academics reveal the workings of economics, they are politically complicit in that oppression. She criticises a naive view that oppressed people already know all of this, and all you have to do is effectively transcribe what they are saying. Another way to consider this is that Spivak thinks that there is a complex layer of mediation between oppressed people and the academic, and that mediation needs to be interrogated, and she accuses Deleuze and Foucault of political naivety for suggesting you can just blow through it and let those people speak for themselves. The difference between representing as describing a group and representing as speaking for. This is how Spivak puts that in the final sentence of part 1. In the face of the possibility that the intellectual is complicit in the personal constitution of other as the self's shadow, a possibility of political practice for the intellectual would be to put the economic under erasure, to see the economic factor as irreducibly as it reinscribes the social text, even as it is erased, however imperfectly, when it claims to be the final determinant, or the transcendental signified. This is no shorter than my 2 glosses. The jargon is not making it more concise. And there is quite a bit of jargon. I've marked every word not used in its more common sense with italics. None of it defined earlier in the paper. Then there is the repetition of the pronoun it, marked in bold. The first time clearly refers to the economic factor. The second follows social text, so should refer to that, but it could refer to the economic factor again. The third it cannot be the same thing as the first or second, because transcendental signifiers are permanent and conspicuous, so cannot be erased. And they are passive, so they cannot reinscribe. And there is no third thing standing in the same relationship to the pronoun as economic factor or social text do to the first two. Despite the conspicuous avoidance of definitions, Spivak has used signifier twice by this point, and so I can be pretty confident she isn't being idiosyncratic here. So to make sense of this paragraph, I have to assume that the signifier in this case is the other, specifically the other created by the self's shadow, a term Spivak has not used up to this point, but I assume to be a synonym for the West as subject, from the first sentence of paragraph 1, which involves a technical use of subject as an active agent rather than the common meaning of something you examine. So understanding that third use of the it pronoun requires relating 4 layers of technical terminology back to the beginning of the essay. Oh, and let me just explain the sick in the middle of the quote. I added that. It means that the word in front, irreducibly, does appear in the original text, but I think it's a mistake. Again, an example of how a technical term saves time, because if you know what sick means, I don't have to explain that I haven't made a typo. There is just an error in the original quote. What's the error? Well, I think it should say irreducible. Irreducibly makes grammatical sense, sort of. It would mean that the economic factor is fundamental only to the same degree that the social text is reinscribed, that is, imperfectly. In other words, the sentence would be saying that the economic factor is not fundamental, that we could break it down into other non-economic elements, such as desire, the concrete, or subject, and all of the other obtuse terms Spivak has spent the last 30 paragraphs critiquing Deleuze and Foucault for trying to reduce things to. So within her argument, irreducibly makes no sense, but irreducible does. So what purpose does this jargon serve? It is clearly not precision, given how imprecisely Spivak uses the it pronoun and irreducibly. It is not concision, like my use of problematize and sick, because here it takes no longer to say what Spivak means than it does to say what Spivak wrote. Let me start by discounting one possibility. We are going to assume Spivak is not incompetent, which means we are going to disregard Spivak's own claims that she has always deplored her own style, which would imply she is not capable of writing otherwise. Even if true, and it's not a productive way to approach a text. Apart from anything else, it does not tell us why it got 25,000 citations. If we want to understand that, we need to see the style as part of the effect of the article, not a hindrance to it. Let me illustrate why that is a useful assumption. There is a very critical response by Terry Eagleton, in which he says Spivak has a duff ear for tone and rhythm, and in the process totally misses the point. Spivak is not unique in this kind of language. This paper first attracted notice after its inclusion in a 1988 collection, and one reviewer describes the whole volume as impenetrable gobbledygook. Yet a feature of the gobbledygook so beloved of contemporary postmodernists is precisely its tone and rhythm, its poetic quality, which draws attention to the mediating effect of language. The text in front of you screams, "Look at me! I am how you see the world." A central theoretical point. But Spivak doesn't do that, deliberately. It does not serve her purpose, which you miss if you assume a duff ear. That quote I gave before suggests how Spivak herself sees it, at least the second half. She thinks she gives her readers ammunition, formulas, that they can claim for themselves. Now on this point, I part company with Deleuze, Foucault and Spivak. I just don't think academics have a political impact. Politics works one way. It shapes what we do. We don't shape politics. though I recognise that these writers are very committed to the idea that they and their academic work are part of a political struggle. Obtuse, unclear, ambiguous and obfuscated writing help with that. It's much easier to co-opt Spivak's work for your own specific purposes in a broadly left-wing, feminist, anti-colonialist context if it's not actually clear what Spivak meant. Of course, it's also personally beneficial because it lets Spivak lean into what is popular and disown as misreadings any criticism. The obvious example is that subsequent feminist authors have read Bhuvaneswari Bhaduri's suicide in 1926 as the central motif of the work, despite her appearing in only 4 paragraphs at the very end. The issue of sati is more central to the essay, but it is worth noting that Part 2 claims that this is an arbitrary example to illustrate the argument with Deleuze and Foucault. But precisely because the article is so ambiguous, Spivak has herself been able to lean into this reading, claiming that it was, despite the text itself, about her relative Bhaduri. In other words, the ambiguity created by the obscurity of the technical jargon allows the text to mean something other than what it says, both for the reader and the author. And that helps explain why it is not poetic, because getting the reader to focus on what the language is doing would undermine the purpose. It just wouldn't work as well if it drew attention to itself. Of course, this is not the only way you could argue the language works, and with anything this successful, 25,000 citations, remember, we would expect it to work multiple ways. You could argue the use of language is metatextual, that it answers the question, can the subaltern speak? Well, no, not like this. This kind of language excludes. It creates a privileged minority, not dissimilar to the way Sanskrit did in the Hindu legal tradition Spivak discusses in the essay. If I'm honest, I don't think that subtle metatextual self-reference is intentional. Spivak usually writes like this, but I think it might be part of the appeal to readers. And that's the point. You can find a bunch of videos online which treat the obtuse prose as a surmountable obstacle worth overcoming because the ideas are important. But I think they miss that the obtuse prose is part of the argument. You cannot divorce it from the ideas in Can the Subaltern Speak? It is deliberately obfuscated, deceptive, difficult and ambiguous. It has been successful because of that, not in spite of it.